You had the message pop up to say it's recording. Perfect.
Gotcha,
Okay.
yeah, Red.
Brilliant. So this session today is about supporting Gestalt communicators with Grid AAC software. Becky and I have chatted about, almost as a disclaimer that we need to make at the start of this session, really, two things. The first one is that this is really going to be scratching the surface, and that's because there is so much research that is going on at the moment around Gestalt and the impact of that on learning AAC, that we're really just saying this is what the current research says. The other thing really is about focusing on the fact that, you know, as research develops, things might change, and we would just make sure that you defer to your local speech and language therapists and clinicians to be the expert in these areas, and keep asking those questions and finding out what's happening with the latest research.
Definitely. There's some really amazing courses out there at the moment. And I think the most important thing that we're really passionate about at Smartbox, and, you know, it's great that so many people are listening today, is that we just want to be providing the best input for the people that we're supporting. And it's really exciting, actually, that although this isn't a new phenomenon, for whatever reason, it has kind of slipped by the wayside for whatever reason. But this has been talked about back in the kind of 60s and 70s, but at the moment it's everywhere, isn't it, Kerry? We've been talking about it a lot on social media. So yeah, this is just a really exciting opportunity for us all to kind of come up to speed to a nice kind of foundation level. But as Kerry said, this is literally scratching the surface, so that there's going to be much more to come.
Okay, let's have a look. So a quick introduction then to what we're going to look at in this session. We're going to briefly go over the types of language processing, and that's to make sure really when we look at that and the stages that we're all kind of at the same foundation and grounding as we go through the webinar. We're then going to think about what are AAC vocabulary requirements for someone who is a Gestalt language processor. We're going to talk about adapting vocabularies in Grid and just start to, again, scratch the surface with some simple personalizations and changes that we might make. And then we couldn't do a session about supporting an AAC user without talking about how we can be a great communication partner. So that's where we'll round it up. If you've got any questions at any point, please type them in the chat. Depending how we're doing for time, we'll try and answer some of the questions in the chat at the end. But Becky and I are happy to record sort of a QA session later on and get that shared out through our marketing team if there's a lot of questions, which there might well be. Obviously, any questions specifically that are clinical, we'd again recommend you go through local speech and language therapists for that. Okay. So our starting point is thinking about natural language acquisition. So when we think about that, we're thinking about the stages that we travel through on our journey to develop language for child language development. What we can see here, and we've tried to represent this, is we've got that really early stage language development and echolalia that we go through. And you can see by the arrows that an analytical language processor continues that journey as they develop language. What we can see with a Gestalt language processor is that they almost get stuck and they stop and don't continue the journey in the same way as an analytic language processor.
We can almost liken it a bit to that a Gestalt language processor almost goes through a few extra stages before they kind of ideally, and you will find that some Gestalt language processors will just go through the stages without kind of any input, whereas others stay around the kind of stage 1, 2 to 3, and at that point it becomes really apparent that they do need that input, as Kerry said, to help them almost become unstuck.
So let's look at and define, so we're all understanding, an analytic language processor and a Gestalt language processor. So I'm going to pass over to Becky for these ones.
Okay, so again, this is quite a lot of familiar information, depending on who's listening to. I'm just mindful that there's a few people saying that they can't see the PowerPoint. I don't know. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm just having to move all these messages off my screen.
That's okay.
Okay, so analytic language processing. I think the first thing to say is that what's great to celebrate right now is that there are actually 2 different ways in which someone can acquire language, use language, process language. So analytic language processing will be something that will become feel quite familiar. Now you're looking at this slide. So the idea is that someone starts with cooing and babbling, and words are kind of start as single units. And then what happens is those magical single words start becoming combined. And then those chunks of information become bigger and bigger and bigger. And that person just kind of travels through the motions, and their language and their experience as a communicator progresses and becomes more authentic, more spontaneous, more flexible, because that use of those individual units, those magical words, get used in lots of different ways. And that's essentially what someone who is an analytic language processor is doing as they're journeying through those different stages of their form of language development.
And this is certainly the most the form of language sort of development that we're most familiar with, that we've learned the most about over the years. So I think all of us will have a certain level of familiarity with those stages at the bottom and understanding it.
Yeah, and another thing to add here is, certainly from a clinical perspective and potentially educational as well, is this is what a lot of the standardized language assessments, checklists, therapy ideas and where to go and what constitutes delay, disorder, all those sorts of components. This is where a lot of it is linked to and influenced by.
Yeah. So on this slide, what we can see is a comparison and the differences for a Gestalt language processor.
Okay, so this is the magic bit. This is the bit where, potentially some of you that are very at the earlier stage, and that's also okay. We'd like to add today is that for some people listening today, this might be completely new to you, and you're kind of thinking, well, so why was I not learning about this perhaps when I was studying, or how are we only starting to hear about this in the literature? But as I said earlier, it has been talked about for a long time, but for some reason it's coming back out now, which is really, really positive. And so Gestalt language processing. So this is another form of natural language acquisition. Okay, so what happens is Gestalt, it's a German term for chunk. So it's almost like that top-down process of taking on board language. So the language is learned in chunks, bigger pieces of information. So those units are essentially bigger. So that person is going through different stages. And as I said earlier, and this isn't about this changing someone from a Gestalt language processor to become analytic. It doesn't work like that. Both forms are natural language acquisition. It's just the person is learning, processing and using language, and therefore communicating and bonding with words in a very different way. And therefore, yeah.
No, I was going to say, I think when we've talked about it, that with Gestalt, what we're focusing on is helping much more help them move between those stages and mitigate some of the gestalts that they've got and break them down into single bits of language, which we're not used to doing with an analytical language processor in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. So we hear this talked about quite a bit, and there's lots of influences in the kind of Gestalt world, and so Gestalt language processors can be termed as intonation babies. So that kind of musical, melodic, rhythmical use of words in sound streams. So what's happening is that you might be observing that person at the kind of stage one, and what might be happening is that you're hearing echolalia or delayed echolalia, or perhaps scripts from TV shows, or particular pieces from a favourite song, and that person is almost overusing that chunk of information to convey something. It's meaningful, it's absolutely meaningful, but it's being used for perhaps lots of different reasons. And then as they travel through the stages, so as I said earlier, it's almost like a Gestalt language processor goes through a few more extra stages before, ideally, if they do it by themselves or not, they start to enter that moment where they start to recognize that words can be used as individual chunks and moved around and changed and manipulated, so that they become a more authentic, spontaneous language user. And that's ultimately, we were saying this yesterday, weren't we, Kerry, what we aspire for, when we're supporting people at Smartboxers, and we should all want this for everyone, is we want someone to communicate as spontaneously, as authentically, as flexibly as possible. We want that for everyone. It's just that depending on whether you're an analytic language processor or a Gestalt language processor. It's just the journey's going to be a bit different, and therefore the support that you may well need to assist you may just look different.
And I think sort of the aha moment for me with this, when we were first learning about it as a company, is when you start to give those examples. So, you know, when you're saying, you know, you might be working with someone who says to infinity and beyond, or mummy go bye-bye, or go, 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 wee. We've quite often all worked with people who, you know, will have those unique phrases that we recognise. And for me, it was like, oh, like now we
Light
know.
bulb moment.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, definitely.
So this here is just, and again, because my background is teaching, things like this are really useful for me. So it's like, actually, what does that look like in the real world? And I like the comparison of like analytic language is about word babies, Gestalt is about the intonation and the sound and the rhythm and the pattern. You know, and you can see here, so this is just one, I know you particularly like boho speechy, Becky, that we've just pulled down, but it's a really nice quick comparison to give you sort of a real sort of visual and foundation for what you might be seeing when you're working with individuals with different types of language processing skills.
Yeah. And there's a really good natural language acquisition checklist that Marge Blanc has, which I would highly recommend if anyone wants to delve deeper, you know, maybe make a start and look at that as well, because it will go into much more detail about this. But who doesn't love a more kind of real life example? So this is a great way to kind of just start to be like, oh, okay, because, you know, you might be a parent listening, or you might be a practitioner, a teacher, so you might have lots of students on your caseload. You might be an adult thinking about this for yourself. So yeah.
I just saw Christine's question pop up and say, is it only for babies? I don't think it means word babies as in literally as in age. I think it just means they are people that are focused on words, or people that are focused on sort of intonation. So it's certainly not, we're not focusing just on babies that very early.
So that kind of stage 1 to 2, what's happened is that the Gestalt language processor hasn't yet reached the point where they have recognized that within that sound stream there are these individual magical units that can be used by themselves or with other words and put together to share all those different reasons why someone might want to communicate.
And again, for me, when we were writing this presentation, this slide is really helpful, because if you look in the column on the right hand side, you can see there's 2 sets of gestalts there, the green ones and the purple ones, and how they would be broken down at each stage for a Gestalt language processor. And this again was a bit of a light bulb for me when we were first learning about it, to actually see the stages and how it's broken down to get to those individual words at stage sort of 4 to 6.
And at stage 1, what you might also be observing is somebody using single word gestalts. So this is where it can feel a bit confusing at times, because we talk about chunks and chunks of information, but actually a Gestalt language processor might be just using single word gestalts. And so how that might then transfer into real world is that word, say, for example, dog, because we know that echolalia and delayed echolalia has meaning. We know that they have learnt that in a particular emotional, you know, it can sometimes be traumatic, something joyous, rich, something went in at that point for them to learn that gestalt at that moment in time, but it might also be a single word. So it's not necessarily that they would be saying, and it also might be unintelligible. And like jargon, there might just be one keyword that you can pick out amongst some jargon as well.
And I guess the big thing that so when Becky and I were writing this, we talked loads about part of our role as a communication partner for a Gestalt language processor is about being a detective, and about making sure that you're thinking, okay, so the top Gestalt there, you've got I love you, you love me, I love you, you love me. So actually what we need to do is break that down and start to think about, well, what does that actually mean? Is it talking about loving someone? Does it happen a specific time of day? You know, what is it linked to? And the one that Becky often gives as an example when we talk about as a team is to infinity and beyond, and that actually underneath that it's actually linked to an individual using it every time that someone leaves the room, and the gestalt is actually about going and leaving. So first, what we've got to do, our role is about being a detective, and then once we know what the gestalts kind of mean, we can then start to break those down and think about how we might mitigate them.
Yeah. I'm mindful that lots of people are asking questions and we've got some hands up. Kerry, should we direct it till the end of the session? And is that okay? So yeah, keep your hand raised or wait till the end, but we can see you, but we're just going to keep going with the presentation just for the minute.
Yeah, so if anyone didn't hear at the beginning, what we said was, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat. Becky and I will try and answer some of the questions at the end, but we're also mindful there's a lot of people on the call, so we will probably afterwards also record a response to questions and share that so that you can have a look at that afterwards as well. So the next stage then is thinking, well, we know some, information and we understand how a Gestalt language processor works, and we know a bit more about the stages, but how can we start supporting those individuals who use AAC then with Grid? So, sent the slides the wrong way. So the first thing, and perhaps one of the most important things, is about making sure that you've got a robust vocabulary. So, and what we mean by robust vocabulary, many of you will be aware, but we put a list there of things that are really, really important and quite often come up, don't they, Becky, in the research around what needs to be a robust vocabulary for an individual. So the first two things there, we've got core and fringe vocabulary, and that's because we need access to all of this rich language that we want to expose the user to, and that we want to be able to help them use to mitigate their gestalts and to start to play with words and language in the same way. Is there anything you'd add on that, Becky?
Yeah, I think, absolutely that. And I think the other thing to say is that this is a journey, and we know that no two people, this is something actually we haven't touched on just yet, but I'll say it now, is that what it's believed, the research is saying that if not all, the majority of autistic people are Gestalt language processors, and that Gestalt language processors, we see a lot more of this in boys than girls. But again, through our planning of this, Kerry and I have acknowledged that. Is that also because of what we know about the research into autism and how girls can be seen to perhaps mask their autistic traits as well? So I think the thing with this is that by having robust, you have options to everything. I watched an amazing YouTube influencer who is a Gestalt language processor, an adult, a speaking autistic adult, a mum, the other day, talk about the importance of having her AAC even though she speaks. And one of the things she was saying is she wishes as a child, she had access to a keyboard. She had access to a voice that wasn't just her own natural spoken voice, because things like medication, her epilepsy especially affected her ability to spontaneously generate information. But if she had access to all these kind of options, these tools, they're all tools, aren't they? Strings to add to your bow, then she would have been able to be more effective as a communicator earlier on in her journey as a communicator. So it's about us not gatekeeping. And I know that sometimes people feel quite overwhelmed by having all of these options, but how are we to truly know someone's capabilities and potential if we don't give them that robust?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm not going to go through the whole list on there, but there's obviously some really key things that we need to focus on when looking for a vocabulary. So what we're going to do now is go and have a look at some things that we might do in Grid. We're going to be looking at Supercore 50, but because that's what we've picked, because Supercore 50 is a robust vocabulary and it includes all of those things on the list. But everything that we're saying will be relevant if you're using other vocabularies. So just be mindful, that obviously it will carry across.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to start by thinking about personalizing vocabulary. And again, with this, I think we just want to make it clear, we're not necessarily saying this is what you have to do. Mm-hmm. We're making suggestions based on what we've looked at in the research at the moment on how we might make little tweaks and changes. And again, it's about the individual. So what we're suggesting might not work for an individual. So go with what their needs and requirements are.
It's really important to be aware of what stage that person's at. So whether they are at that stage 1, that kind of echolalia, the delayed echolalia, whether they're at stage 2, when they're starting to possibly mix and match their gestalts. In much the same way as an analytic language processor, we encourage more words. We want to build and extend and enhance all the vocabulary around them, For a Gestalt language processor, we want to give them more gestalts at that early stage. And then when they get to that stage 3, which is where it starts to get really magical and they start to recognize that there are these individual words. So each stage is really key. So therefore, what you do at each stage is slightly different. So it will then therefore influence the journey they're at as an AAC user.
Yeah, so the first thing we're going to look at is about making gestalts available. So a lot of the research at the moment is saying definitely it's really important that we make those gestalts available on the individual's device. That doesn't mean it replaces the fact that they will want to speak them from time to time, but it's important because it's their device, that it's got their language and phrases and words in the same way that we would personalize a device for anybody. So what we need to think about is where to put them. So I'm just going to hop into SuperCore now. And Becky and I, when we were writing this, had loads of conversation about where we could actually put it. And those stages actually can be a big influence. So what we were thinking about is if you've got an individual who you are aware is a Gestalt language processor, and you have identified a number of gestalts that they use really frequently, but we might not have quite got to the point where we fully understand what those gestalts are. So we're still doing the detective work as their communication partner. Then one thing that you can do is add a page which is about my gestalts, so that they've got their own space to go to where their gestalts live. So the recommendation here is to go, from us, might be to go into somewhere where there's blank cells. So we've gone into topics here. So one example might be if I go into topics and pop it in edit mode. And I'm going to get the user involved in this if they want to be. So I'm going to change the label to this to be my gestalts. And again, some users might not be happy with this, so you have to go with the user once.
Could be my phrases, important things, just
whatever they want to say. So we're going to put that on the tab there, and then this will jump to a page where we can then add in some of the key information that they're key quotes and gestalts that they're using. So the other thing we talked about actually was about symbols. So as you can see, obviously I've got a selection of symbols here, or I can go and find a picture. It would also be important to get the user, if they want to be involved in saying, well, what's the actual image that I want using for this cell. So I'm just going to pop one on there for now, but usually I would ask the user to be involved in helping that. So I'm going to follow that jump.
And I think just while Kerry's doing this, I'm already getting goosebumps, because I think something important to say, speaking from experience and things that I've observed as well, and actually I'll hands up admit as a clinician, I may well have done in the past, is that these gestalts, this echolalia, these scripts, you know, if that person is at this stage, there has been in the past encouragement to divert or dare I say ignore, and change subject. But actually this is completely normal. It's completely part of that person's language development journey. And so how awesome that we are at this stage where we are like, absolutely, we need to honor, respect, acknowledge, make available, use them ourselves, you know, or the rhythm of them when we're kind of responding back. So it's just lovely to see this, isn't it?
Yeah, and fundamentally those gestalts are basically someone trying to make a connection, so
they have meaning. Yeah.
So we've gone into topics because, you know, that was one of the spaces where there's lots of space for personalizing in there. It might not be the best place for some users, so think about, you know, different options within the vocabulary. When I'm in here, I'm then going to start to add in an individual's gestalt. So I'm going to go to create a cell. I'm going to add a write cell. I'm not going to do lots of editing because this isn't an editing lesson, but I'm actually going to write to infinity and beyond. And then I'm going to add an image. In this case, I'm going to put Buzz Lightyear in for now, but it might not be, again, that's what the individual wants on the cell, but I'm just going to pop it in. So we need to just accept that, again, adding these into someone's vocabulary will be, you know, a joint process that's done with the user.
And the chances are that gestalt, which we have observed being used by somebody, did come from a pure joy, amazing, awesome moment by enjoying the film Toy Story, and therefore that's where it kind of cemented into that person. But yeah, one of our big tips is that don't necessarily take the Gestalt literally, and that's why it's really important to play detective and do that language analysis and just almost step back and observe and think, right, when is it that that person's using that Gestalt? It can we kind of work out and play detective together and work out, what it might mean, because there will be a meaning behind it.
Yeah. So I'm just going to save this for a second, just so we can have a look. So at the moment, we've just popped a page on the topic page where we're adding in our gestalts. We might not do that later on if somebody was, further down the stages. So later on, we might, for example, start to think about feelings. And if we know someone's got a gestalt which we know means they're excited or they're sad, we might start to think about, let's co-locate it with the word. So let's put wee with excited, or something else, so that we're starting to make that connection between the gestalt and the word. We might also still have it on the My Gestalts page and then have it other places in their vocabulary as well, so that they can access it alongside some of the core vocabulary that it relates to, but also as a gestalt by itself if that's where they want it.
We've got some really good questions coming up, guys, and we will come to what you're asking. Someone I think missed what we said, but yeah, you don't have to call it My Gestalts. So again, it is so dependent on making it individual for that person. So yeah, absolutely. Someone asked, would it not be My Phrases? Absolutely. And we'll talk a bit more about color coding and functional, because yes, ultimately we want communication to be functional. So we should come to that, and if not, we'll answer it in the Q&A.
Yeah, and I also think about the colour coding, I would try to keep it in keeping probably with the rest of the vocabulary. So what you might not want is to go to a page that's then all of a sudden got loads of different colours when they're used to, a set colour tones. And if you are editing in Grid, and and I know in lots of other software as well, you can have themes. So the cells in Supercore, for example, have a theme colour, so you can match that if you're adding in the gestalts on a brand new grid.
Yeah, and one of the don'ts when using AAC, even though we don't necessarily have to think as strictly about supporting the motor planner for a Gestalt language processor, what we would still encourage is that you don't change that kind of master screen and that kind of overall layout, because we also need to be thinking about the next stages and that trajectory for that person as a communicator.
Yeah. So the next one, I'm not going to go and make loads of edits for this one, but make sure things of interest are available. Now, this is not unique to a Gestalt language processor. No. We always say this when we're thinking about any AAC user, but it's really important that we have content in their AAC which is relevant and motivating, and the words that they want to talk about. So we obviously have got a lot of topics in there. There's school language, there's messages, but one thing Becky and I were talking about yesterday is you could have a user who might have a particular interest in dogs, for example. Obviously, the word dog is available in Supercore, but you might want to create a page which has lots of different types of dogs. So it could have, I don't know, a Labrador, an Alsatian, a Westie, loads of different types of dogs on there. And I think it's important to know their interests and add those in as well. So as well as adding the gestalts in, we're doing what we would usually do and personalize it to make sure that their interests are available.
Even more than ever before, there is this almost permission now and this reassurance that we need to be more led and not necessarily so focused on perhaps tabletop activities and getting out a particular box of toys, because what we're noticing, and I've noticed this a lot in my practice, is that if that person then isn't interested, there's this misconception that they're not wanting to communicate or they're not making progress as such. But what it is we need to be watchful, waiting, observing, taking our time. What is of interest to that person? What lights them up? What really motivates them? What are they drawn to? Because if we then reach them at that point and go along the journey with them in that respect, rather than be more kind of adult led or professional led, then we are going to see the more meaningful opportunities for them to then extend and enhance their communication.
The next bullet point, to save me flicking back, was about thinking about adding in recordings actually. So we acknowledge that part of the nature of a gestalt is that they're quite sing-songy, there's loads of intonation in there, and quite often we may not be able to represent that in the same way, through a voice within the software. So it's really important that we think about, do we actually want to add in recorded gestalts? Now we might add in both. So I might have one that's got the spoken voice on it, and then another one where I'm going to add in a recorded version. So to do that, I'll do it next to it. So we'll have them next to each other. So I'm going to create a cell. And there is a cell within Grid called Play Sound. So I'm going to search it, and I'm scrolling down here. I like this one because it's really quick to add and edit, sort of on the spot. You don't have to go out and do it. So there's two ways you can do this. You can now browse for a sound if you've got it saved on your device or PC. You can also actually record while you're here. So, and that could be the user records or member of the therapy team and other students. So anyone can record that message. It's important that it,
the clip that they're enjoying.
But I would record that. So I'm not going to do it now, but you would record it, and then you press stop. You can hear it back as well once you've recorded it to check that the user is happy with it. And then on the play sound, I would just be changing the label again. I've just changed to infinity, and then we would change the image as well to match that. And again, you might want to have both. You might want to have one that's being spoken by the device and one that's got a recording on it, or you might want to have loads of recording initially. That might be the starting point for an individual. But again, we need to be led by what an individual wants and how they want to use things in their device.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to say at this point, which is probably obvious, but I'll say it anyway, is that the rhythm to which we respond and interact as well with someone. So again, this is subject to what stage they're at as well, I might add, because they might be past this stage. You might be raising a Gestalt language processor who's already entering kind of stage 3, 4. You might be working with someone who is at kind of stage 2. But how we respond. So in fact, I was at a set-in a couple of days ago, and I was in a classroom, and I was working with all of the students, but there was one particular student that kept repeating the same thing over and over. And what I did was I acknowledged it by saying it, but then what I did was I used his rhythm, and I kind of added and tweaked his gestalt, and he came over and started following me around the room. So we then experienced this kind of shared attention and this kind of connection together, which ultimately is what we want to feel and achieve for everyone. It might just look slightly different, and that was because I was taking on board the kind of the rhythm and the intonation side that drew him in, so that we then had a moment together. It was really positive, and it went on for quite a while.
That's great. I love that example. I'm just mindful we've got about 10 minutes left.
I know.
We could talk about this for hours, but so the last one on here is about making clips from films, music, and TV available. And because there is a high chance that some of the gestalts will have come from those places. There's two kind of thoughts around this. So if a user wants to be able to access them from within their AAC, they might go into, so SuperCore has already got apps added. And there's some good ones in here. So there's I've not turned mine off. That one there, Alexa, say it quietly.
Oh gosh.
She went off yesterday when we were going through this. There's that one, so where we can preset a cell to request a certain song or through the device. We've also got access to YouTube Kids video, music, even photographs, which are going to be really relevant that we want to put in for the user. One of the things that Becky and I talked about when having access to these types of things is that that they might need to be higher up. So if there were blank cells, which there are here in edit mode, so if I just show you, we might want to perhaps pop them somewhere so the ones that they need, they can access quite quickly at the top. The other thing Becky and I looked at was and talked about was whether they might want to access them outside of their vocabulary. So that's where we might want to think about whether we want to use an accessible app, which I'm not going to give you a demo of now, but you've got access to things like YouTube and YouTube Kids, music and video, the Amazon Echo, Grid as well, and that could be outside of their AAC. And again, that's about understanding what is it the individual wants and needs, and how they want to use and access gestalts or things that relate to their gestalts.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about personalizing. The other thing, which we just love talking about this bit, is about making the most of the settings available. So there's 3 things really within there. The first one is about choosing the voice they want. And Becky and I acknowledge that actually a lot of the gestalts that people use might, for example, come from an American film. So the user might want an American accent, or an accent, relating to where the gestalt comes from. But that also might change. So they might want an American accent, for a month, and then they might want to change, or and we need to honour that and make sure that the voice reflects how they want to be expressing their language and their gestalts.
Yeah, I love that. It's so important. We talk about our voice being our identity. It reflects our personality. So we absolutely need to support. Again, if this Gestalt language processor needs AAC, we need to be supporting them on an operational competency level to be aware that they can access those voice settings and tweak them and change them if they want to.
Changing voices is really common. My example to Becky is that my 2 boys, usually after Becky's visited, will spend quite a significant amount of time talking in a Bristol accent, and they use that just to make fun, not to make fun of Becky, but to have fun and to be jovial and have a laugh, and the fact that they enjoyed spending time with you. And it's that we do that anyway naturally, so I think it's fine to be dipping in and out of different voices if that's what the user wants.
Pure joy moments. Feel good. Yeah.
So when you're going into the voices here, obviously mine are currently set to English UK, but I can flick into English United States, or there's obviously other voices available within there as well. So it's just to think about what voice is it that the user would like to have, and it might be that we need to try a few with them. The other thing is about configuring that voice. So we talked about adding in recordings because gestalts do have quite a sing-songy and rich intonation, but we might want to try and start to make that more available in the speaking voice that they're using. So we've got small adjustments we can make. So tweaks to things like speed and pitch will all help to sort of making the voice that they've chosen present that gestalt in a way that represents how they want to say it. So there's some small tweaks there that you can make as well. The last one is around pronunciation. So because gestalts are quite often a string of words together in one chunk, then therefore when we break it down in the software, it's going to be said as individual words. So we might want to go into pronunciation and type in the gestalt here, and then play around with how do we want that pronounced to make sure that it represents how the user wants it to be said. Okay. So this bit then I just really love. We want to be a great communication partner, and we talk about it loads for all of our AAC users, but focusing on how can we do that specifically for our Gestalt language processors. What do we need to provide as communication partners?
There's a lot, isn't there? We put a lot of emphasis on what the person that we're supporting, or if they are in fact an AAC user, what they should be working towards, but we all have a part to play as well.
Definitely. So there's loads in there. Things like making interactions meaningful to the learner. And I did see a question pop up about, well, how do you respond to a gestalt? And I think the example that Becky gave earlier, if you don't know what a gestalt means because we haven't done that detective work yet, you can still respond. So Becky echoed the intonation in the individual's gestalt when she was speaking to them, and that got their attention. And it's just recognizing that, well, I hear what you've said and I recognize that there was meaning behind it because I listened to you. So even that kind of initial interaction where we don't know what the gestalt means is really important.
And then, so if they're around that stage 2, maybe even emerging stage 3, the idea is that they're starting to mix and match their gestalts, because at stage 1, you've been supporting them to have more gestalts, like an analytic processor, we're wanting to give them more words. Or stage 1, we're kind of working on what the gestalts mean, where we're at with them, embracing them, and then giving them more gestalts that support all those different communication functions. And then stage 2 into 3, it's this mitigation, this breakdown, this mix and match. So it might be that you add in another word. So if they say go, 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 depending on what you're doing with them, you might say go, 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 car, go, 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 car. We're off we go. We're going to the, so it's again, but so this is why it's so important that you don't use someone else's. It's about understanding that individual person, language analysis, what we think it means. It's not what we definitely know it means, it's what we think it means, and then that kind of trial and error and stuff, but understanding what stage they're at. And that's why it's really important to be supported by a speech and language therapist as well.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I noticed some of the questions in the chat are sort of clinical questions, and we would say that is any of those sorts of things you need to work directly with the speech and language therapist that's involved with the individual. We can obviously make recommendations about the software and sort of tweaks that you can make, but we would defer to the clinical professional in any sort of AAC user support.
Yeah.
We added this one in because we really like the idea of celebrating that there are different types of processing language, and the journey that people go on is different to developing sort of language. And we like the fact that by acknowledging that Gestalt language processing is a form of natural language acquisition. That
there's 2 ways. You're one or the other. It's not about becoming the other. And it's about celebrating and respecting that, and then recognizing therefore what the strategies are that will support that person.
Definitely. And we really liked this, and it's about recognizing and making sure that we let any language processor know that they're competent, that we value their conversation, that we're interested in their thoughts and feelings and ideas, and that we show them that we believe what they've got to say is important. And I'm not in a rush, I don't have to disappear. So we just took this again from Instagram because we thought it was lovely and a real kind of nice example in there. Okay, so that felt like a real whistle stop tour. And
I'm sorry, guys,
actually that we could spend so long talking about Gestalt and analytic language processors. We could spend so long. So I'm going to dip into the chat and stop sharing. I've seen loads of questions pop up, so it might
thank you so much for everyone. And I think, Kerry, we probably are going to end up doing a bit of a recorded Q&A, because we really want to make sure that anything we can do to support you guys, we really want to do. But as Kerry said, it's going to be very much, this shouldn't replace clinical expertise out in the field, and working as a team.
Definitely. And I know a few people have asked for the references. We'll send the slides round as well, and we can add a slide in which has got some of the research that Becky and I referred to throughout this session. So we'll be able to share the presentation as well. Interesting one. Can language acquisition, and I'll defer to Becky if you've seen anything in the research about this, can language acquisition be a combination of both rather than either? Do we know anything about that yet?
So the Meaningful Speech SLP out in America, Alexandra Zakos, who I've started her courses. She's amazing, by the way. She did touch on this, and as did Marge Blanc, that it's not common, and so then people are like, whoa, so how do you manage this? But I think it then comes back to getting to know that individual, who they are, what matters to them, playing detective, watchful waiting, making it robust if they need AAC. Because that's the other thing to say. Some GLPs will just go through the motions and become able to use complex grammar and advanced grammar and be authentic and flexible, and that they will just transition through. I know people, I've got adult friends that I know they've done this and they've never used AAC. So Yeah, but so yes, in short, but it's I believe, and certainly from my experience and from what I've heard from the SRPs out in America, it's not common, but it could be possible.
Brilliant. I'm mindful that we've run out of time. It's 11:15. So what we will do, there are loads of questions in there. So Becky and I will go through the questions, and we will do record a Q&A. So as well as the recording from this actual session, we will ask our marketing team to send out the recording of as many questions that we can answer as possible. Some of the clinical ones we won't necessarily go into, or we might direct you to research or a course that we know would be relevant and perhaps answer those. So I just want to say thank you so much for
thank you guys
for joining us, and for just, we could discuss this forever. It's such an important topic at the moment, so I think we just need to keep exploring it, following the research, and we may do a follow-up in a couple of months, and once we've got the next sort of group of stuff to talk about. So
yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.